Good morning and welcome, and thank you, Georgia, for that introduction. I'm delighted to say that I have a fabulous panel with me today who are going to help to discuss some of those and probably a bunch of other things that are not actually on that particular title. We're looking at the future of education. And the first of those is Professor Rose Luckin, who's I'd like to introduce now. And Rose is does a lot of her work at UCL, but is involved in many other things, including being an author, Pro-Vice Chancellor, former teacher, actually. So Rose has got a great perspective here, I think, in what we really need to do. But, you know, Rose has been very much involved in looking at AI, the future of learning, about, you know, learning scenarios, how we could potentially use technology effectively to enhance the teaching experience and the learning experience. So, Rose, welcome. Great to have you,
Thank you.
on board.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to see you again. So my next guest is Dr. David Lefevre, and David's based at Imperial College. That's David sort of to the down below me, I think. Hi, David. David's based at Imperial College, and he's a lot of experience in actually implementing learning platforms. So although the title of this talked about schools, but it talked about colleges, we will be talking about higher education and education in general, because it's really important that we think of this holistically. There's a journey going on here, and we have to take people at those various stages. And it isn't that schools have got it sorted and universities haven't, or vice versa. But nonetheless, David has done some really interesting things with learning platforms. I think put the first global MBA online at Imperial College, and has been, you know, looking at the principles of teaching and how we can enhance that, similar as we discussed with Rose, but also about relationships, how we get people involved, and how do we make this an environment that's actually inclusive in the way that it does things. So welcome, David. Great to have you on board as well. And my final guest, who's appeared in the bottom right, or he has in mine, I'm assuming it has in yours as well, is Dr. Andrew Cunningham. And Andrew works for the Aga Khan Foundation. And as you might imagine, with the Aga Khan Foundation, it's got a very global perspective. And some of the insights that Andrew's already shared with me over our kind of briefing sessions has been looking at the aspects of education in different countries. How is it affected? How far are we going? What can we learn from other countries? But also, you know, where are some of the challenges we have that maybe we have to consider here? So great panel. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you for, you know, this session for 45 minutes or so. And then just for those who are listening, as Georgia said, there'll be a Q&A session which you hook into via a separate link, but you'll be able to then ask questions on the Q&A to make sure that you can get your particular question answered, and all the panel will be able to, I'll facilitate those sessions with the panel. So anyway, so in the meantime, Rose, I wonder if you'd kick us off. I mean, Rose, you and I sat on a panel not dissimilar to this last year, and I think at that time we thought, you know, there's a lot to be done. Education can be reformed. There are real opportunities, but, you know, the whole world has changed since then in lots of ways, not least of which is, of course, a COVID crisis and the fact we're doing this whole thing virtually, and kids have been homeschooled, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wonder if you'd like to reflect a little on, you know, what the last year has felt like, whether you think we've made progress, if we've gone backwards, you know, and maybe some of the newer challenges that are starting to appear.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And a bit like football, it's a year of two halves, isn't it? Because there's the pre-COVID and there's the post-COVID. And certainly when we talked last year, we were very much trying to get the message across that there was huge potential for artificial intelligence technologies to transform education, and not in a way that meant it was all about the devices, but in a way where it was about AI assisting human teachers, really trying to augment the power of human teachers to provide personalized adaptive learning, but not with rooms of students just interacting with devices. That was a big message that we wanted to get across, that it was about more than the visible technology. A lot of it was about data and analysis and understanding the richness of human intelligence and human learning, which is, of course, what we can do with AI, with good AI, which is designed in a way that's informed by what we've learned about how humans learn. Because I think one thing that's often forgotten when we talk about the amazing strides forward in AI is that actually over the same period, we've made amazing strides forward in understanding human learning. And actually the way that things that perhaps we've not focused on enough before, such as emotion, are really very, very important when it comes to human learning. So we were in that space, looking towards the future, thinking about this augmenting education with AI. And then we end up in a space where everything changes overnight almost. And, if you and I had said last year, well, wouldn't it be great to have a massive global experiment? We could collect lots of data and we could really understand what works when it comes to technology. Well, we're kind of in that massive global experiment. And I think it's been hugely stressful and very, very difficult for educators, parents, learners, families, in so many different ways. And I think the immense amount of effort that people have put in to try and make education work in incredibly difficult circumstances. And no, it's not worked universally. And I know Andrew will say more about that later. But, a lot has been done amazingly quickly. And I think we've learned a lot. But what I worry about is that I don't think we're necessarily collecting the data that we need to really understand precisely what's worked for whom, where, and how. And what I worry about is that as children start to go back to school, we'll kind of revert back into this, previous place and forget all that's happened during this change. I mean, I know I read in the paper this morning in the UK, it looks like children, the majority of children won't be back at school until September. So it's a long way and we have to change. And there'll be hybrid versions where some students will be at school, some will still be at home, and that will still mean using the technology. But I really feel we owe it to the people who've made a huge effort during this time, and also to the people who suffered during this time, to make sure that we learn from this and that we really try and progress and leverage that learning and build on that learning to make a good long-term transformation.
I mean, those are great. Sorry, Rose, it's a great point, particularly I think the idea of collecting data, and I'd love to talk a bit more about that as we go on, how we do get it right, because you could argue we've got a little bit of time now if the kids are not going to go back, but of course we've already got other learning environments developing at the moment, and I think one of the mistakes, and maybe David, you could comment on this really, which is that obviously you've had experience in higher education, and a little bit of the, general sense is, well, why don't you just stick all the curriculum online? It'll all be fine and everybody will be able to just do it one day. It's obvious, It's not as easy as that is. I mean, there's a lot needs to be thought about what Rose mentioned, the actual teaching and learning experience and how you do that. Give us a few reflections on that, maybe generally, but also in the context of this kind of shock that we've had, this motivation drive that we've had.
Yeah, well, the shock we've had has resulted in the greatest education experiment of our time, I think. And I completely support, Rose's suggestion that we need to gather data right now if we're going to make the most of this. But I think it's true that we all did just move online. I think certainly at Imperial and the universities around the country, we had 2 days to move online. So in the pre-COVID work, we planned a new online program for 12 months, consultations with student reps and QA officials and all kinds of things. And we moved hundreds of degree programs online in 2 days. And so the only thing we could do really was take technical solutions, so we moved classes to webinar format. Which worked. Students were able to continue studying, which was the main thing. But this wasn't an educational solution. This was a technical solution. And we all knew, as soon as we implemented this, we knew that it wouldn't be sustainable, because education is a matter of educational design and learning design and considerations of pedagogy. So the race was to implement more pedagogical minded designs before students started asking for their money back. And we, at Imperial at least, and many other universities, we just about managed that. So the calls for reimbursements of fees started appearing in the press, just as we managed to address the issue of making our courses more pedagogical, more learning focused. And
you've done some work on that already in the executive or in the MBA that you put online, so you must have had some of the kind of learning of that, or had that not dissipated through the university yet? Had it stuck within certain environments?
Yeah, I mean, it was super helpful. It meant that we had an understanding of what works online, and we had capability and confidence to do this. But historically, designing an online course, takes the Open University often up to 2 years. In Imperial, it's a minimum of 6 months. So all those knowledge and processes about what works and what didn't work weren't actually that helpful. We had to start from scratch and create new models, faster models that could be adopted at scale. And this is what's happening across higher education. And I also see it in schools too. I mean, primarily through my own children who are also studying online, and I see some fantastic, pedagogically minded models emerging. So the answer to the question is, you can't just move online quickly, because it will result in poor learning experiences. Students begin to get disengaged. People will start asking for refunds. Moving online right now, where we stand right now, needs of care, creativity, expertise, great technology, time, thoroughness, and so on. It's a deep process if you want to create the kind of experiences that are going to be effective.
Yeah, and I think the point that both of you have made here, which is interesting about the data, but also there's this sort of concept of best practice sharing as well, which in business, we often is where the real success comes. People gather and use the data effectively if they share best practice and collaborate. Collaborations, I know, has been a big theme of the conference here. People recognizing that the technology, of course, gives us an opportunity to do that. The fact that we're able to assemble you all from all around, the country, in fact, around Europe, together quickly and do things that, would have been quite difficult to do at the time, does offer the opportunity to collaborate better. It doesn't mean you actually do collaborate better. And I think, the thoughtfulness of where we're going on here is important. But before we go on to talk about that, maybe it can bring you in a little, Andrew, because, Andrew, your experience, obviously, in a much more global sense, is not only with the kind of haves and have-nots within the UK, or maybe people in some parts of the education system versus other, but in environments that are much more harsh and difficult, but maybe even have a greater requirement. And maybe you could give us a little bit of a reflection on, kind of grounding as a bit, but that's all very well, but when you're here, how does that work? And give us a little reflection on that. That'd be helpful.
No, thanks so much. I think when we're thinking about Education 4.0, globally within the Aga Khan Foundation, but then many of our partners in countries like Afghanistan, Kenya, Uganda, India, we've actually been imagining a future where social emotional learning and questions of inclusion and equity and how to become a contributing member to society would actually be answered. And in fact, with COVID-19, with the world closing its schools, I think everyone has also almost woken up to this value that actually we need to be preparing kids to be more resilient, to be a lot more around problem solving, and a lot more connected to their families and their communities. And many times the curriculum has just actually ignored that priority. Now, how do you achieve that in environments where we don't have any internet, where we don't have even a consistent connection to radio? And even with the inclusion of SMS technologies, imagine a teacher receiving an SMS from 150 of her students, where in many of our countries, that is the actual ratio between one teacher and her classroom of students. But in fact, what we found over the course of these last 3 months is actually an awakening towards this realization that, in fact, asking students and also their families more about what they're learning at school is actually helping bridge this divide that has existed and actually has grown over the course of the last 2 decades between what it means to be an educator and what it means to be educated, meaning the student. And I think whether that is a question of more online communications and opportunities for connection, or more basic technologies that are more dynamic, inclusive, and equitable of radio, WhatsApp, I think we need to also just put Education 4.0 into the center of this conversation of technology for what, data for whom, and also results in terms of learning outcomes for this long term.
Yeah, I mean, those are really interesting points, because I think we all have learned probably in our lives and work, that when you actually collaborate, when you ask people what they really want, when you involve people in building strategy, when you talk to employees about how you want to do things, it works better. And I think it's true in this world as well. And I think particularly given the shock we're in, or the change we're in, that's important. And I think it's also important, to your point, Rose, that when we think about AI and the next generation of this, that we do the same, that we weave that into the way that we think about this. It's not just, oh, we've got a bunch of teachers who know how to do it, so let's just do it that way. There's going to be a very different experience here, and maybe a little bit of a sense of that, because I know you've thought a lot about how this technology and evolving parts of the technology could affect it. Maybe you could give us a bit of reflection on that.
Absolutely. I mean, throughout my research career, I've always believed in participatory design, and that is about, bringing communities together. And I think now the best way to leverage AI in this situation, or indeed any technology, is through multi-stakeholder collaborations. I mean, when we started the Educate program in 2017 with our lovely golden triangle with its 3 points, that was absolutely about bringing people together. It was about bringing educators, people who use the technology, together with people who build the technology, and researchers like us who can help them understand, is it working or not, in a much more sophisticated way than the normal, does it work or not? Really, what are we understanding? And I think when it comes to AI, it's fundamental that we do this, because why on earth would teachers and learners and parents know anything about AI? It's not their job, is it? I mean, we need to help them understand, but why would they? But in the same way, why do AI developers understand anything about teaching and learning? Actually, most of them don't. So you really need them working together in that real participatory design. And it's not a case of teachers saying, I'd like this, because designers will say, oh, but teachers don't understand enough. They don't know what's really possible. Really good participatory design is a skill. You have to do it carefully. You have to make sure that you're not limiting what you do with the technology by people's current understanding of the technology. But what you're doing is actually really enabling everybody to work together, so you end up with a better product, service, application, and you end up with a community who are much better educated about each other's perspectives. So educators who understand more about AI developers who understand more about teaching and learning, and everybody understanding more about the importance of data and evidence. And one thing I'd like to add to that is that I think two things, listening to Andrew, it's very unfortunate that in the English language, we don't have a word that combines teaching and learning as they do in many languages such as Russian, and that we separate them, and yet they're not. They're so closely interleaved. I think that's really important. And the second thing is that I think one of the things we've got to recognize and try and leverage our AI, but ethically, which is going to be challenging, is that context is hugely important for learning. And people in this current situation are learning in so many different sorts of environments with, they could be watching the same content, but their context, their experience of that is very, very different. And so we need to find a way of indexing and leverage our understanding of those contexts to try and help inform the way we use technology. But as I say, that's ethically very challenging. But again, we'll solve that much more effectively through participatory, collaborative design.
It's interesting, isn't it? Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I just want to completely support what Rose is saying. It's absolutely the case that we're moving to the situation now where success in digital education requires computer scientists, education specialists, researchers, mathematicians. It's multi-skilled, and neither of them do have expertise in each other's field. So they absolutely have to work together. And maybe the nuance I'd add is that you need to strike the balance of voices within that conversation, because what you often find is Edtech firms, usually almost always started by computer scientists who get started, engage with the market, decide they need some education expertise, and hire some junior education people in their organization who don't have a strong voice. And the opposite happens, of course. If you're a university or an education establishment, you decide you need some IT, but you don't bring the IT people to the top table. But really, to have success, you need a balance between the education specialists, the AI specialists, the computer scientists. They all need to be at the top table, all with an equal voice, all working together. And that's the only way to really succeed, well, fulfill the potential of whatever project you're on. So yeah,
point around the participatory design. So, you know, with the consortium of foundations, so the IKEA Foundation, Lego Foundation, Wellspring, Portuguese, Dubai Cares, the Tau Social Foundation, and the Aga Khan Foundation and Jacobs Foundation, we all said we need to flip the mindset of how we design the future of education. And we then launched this year in partnership with 10 different countries, this program called Schools 2030. So actually supporting 1,000 schools over 10 countries for 10 years of actually how to bring design thinking into the hands and into the hearts of the teachers for them to decide what works from their own context, as Rose said. Now, that project was beginning this year, and then COVID hits in March. So then how did we actually then keep that ethical orientation for participation alive across 10 countries with our colleagues that, frankly, barely had an internet connection? And I just wanted to offer this as a concrete example of maybe it's a preview that we've been experiencing, but we had to find, well, how do you design thinking without Post-its on the wall? I mean, really, you know, how do you do this sort of participatory learning in action, sort of, you know, 4.0 or in this instance? And we had to experiment with Mural. I mean, we're at a tech conference. It's not an endorsement, but it's what was available. And it has been amazing over the last 3 weeks, where not only are our colleagues from India, Kenya, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, you know, some of them are even driving to where there is an internet hotspot to participate in making their different contributions. But most importantly, which just happened yesterday, they had to go out and interview the stakeholders that are succeeding against the odds to deliver teaching and learning in COVID-19. And they interviewed ministry officials by phone, interviewed parents. They asked students to screen grab what they've been receiving on their WhatsApp messages to see actually what is it. And those kind of insights coming from the front line, I think, is finally giving a little bit more of a reorientation to local realities that then inform the kind of support that the international aid industry, the private philanthropy, but also the innovators that you were talking about, David, that could actually respond and create that solution together. So I just wanted to offer that, and we're in this experiment, and it's been fascinating.
That's a great example. That's just schools2030.org, isn't it? Is the URL, I think. So we definitely work following that and keeping up to date with it. One of the things that fascinates me about this is, of course, you know, one of the characteristics of this technology is it actually changes the way you participate as well. So, you know, it's grabbing this opportunity at the time. I remember, you know, I formerly was chief executive of Cisco in the UK and Ireland, and we went heavily down the collaboration route, of course. And one of the things we found is we stopped having things like quarterly business reviews. We did them weekly and quickly and dynamically, and got up-to-date stuff, and it was less formal, less of a dog and pony show. And so people actually found that they were doing things more actively than they were before. And I think that's kind of the sort of hidden opportunity. It appears the fact that I've been able to often this week or last week to just get people on a call quite quickly because they didn't have to travel to London or do whatever they did. So I think there's some brilliant opportunities. I also think it's hugely ironic that, you know, Miro, which I've been using in some work with McKinsey, is essentially Post-it notes, which is all this great technology. We're going back to Post-it notes in a very sophisticated way. I'm dissing Miro, but it's great to see that that's the case. So these are brilliant. And I think one of the other things you talked about, Andrew, was the fact that, you know, the context is so different in some of these environments. You know, hardware is not an assumption. And it's not in the UK, to be fair. We've got 1.9 million people in the UK who have had struggles in getting, you know, access to the internet during this time, unfortunately overlapping with some of the most vulnerable people as well. But in other countries, it's just not an expectation at all. I mean, you have to think different ways. On the other hand, I think there are some countries who have leapfrogged us, as we know, and there's been a lot of talk about India and other places where mobile technology is more active. So I think that's a powerful context as well, Andrew, and something that I think we need to continue to ground ourselves on, isn't it?
And building on that, I mean, just imagine, a group of, so we do a lot of girls' education work in Afghanistan with DFID and many other partners, one of the largest implementing programs in the world for girls' education and the Girls' Education Challenge. And in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, when you take away the school, you then take away that one opportunity that these young girls have to actually remember that they are a child or a young person. Outside of school, now they're back to actually doing, frankly, what grown-ups are meant to do at that age. And we've been seeing over the course of even COVID-19 a rise in arranged marriages and early marriages, because without school, families don't have this sort of other pathway or this other narrative to follow. And so building on your point around actually some of these basic technologies, actually just having messages that we've been sending out to almost 20,000 girls of just actually reminding them that they are included in a learning community, even though they're not physically in a school. It's that sense of belonging that any one of these platforms, whether that is in London or whether that is in Bamiyan, Afghanistan, it is actually kids are needing to feel a sense of belonging. And if that is what Education 4.0 can actually increase more of and take advantage of, these different opportunities, have different conversations more frequently, I think that is what we could actually grasp onto and actually move the needle on a bit further.
Yeah, that's a powerful message. And I think, we do need to think, we're talking about Education 4.0 here as, kind of both an opportunity for where we are today, but obviously a vision of the future. And it just, I guess we're all enthusiastic about it. We kind of see that there's an opportunity here and something we can do. But how do we actually make this happen? What are the things we need to do? I mean, you've given us a great example of the Schools 2030 environment. Rose, you're actively involved in so many areas trying to get this to become a reality. Because I don't think we're just doing Education 4.0 because it's after 3.0. We're doing it because it's better potentially.
Yes.
If we get it right. And I guess the steps to do that, how do we take those steps?
I think it is about, in the end, it's a lot about hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Because, we know, David said earlier, the importance of pedagogy, and it's absolutely true. But we know that actually a lot of the aspects of learning that we have not traditionally paid attention to are fundamentally important. Particularly things like metacognition, emotional intelligence, but meta-emotional intelligence, understanding how you're developing. And really the sort of gold is self-efficacy, where we have people who can leverage the resources in their context to help them achieve the goals that they have set for themselves. And I think we know psychologically and from other social sciences that this is what we need people to do. But in the past, we haven't really had the resources, the technology to help us do that, but we do now. So I think we need to do a piece of work that helps people get ready for this. And some of the stuff we've been working on actually for the last few years is this notion of getting AI ready. So, it's very much about taking an organization, a school, a college, a university, and trying to get that community to look at themselves through a data and an AI lens, and to try and see themselves in that way, and to think about the big challenges that they face, and to start to appreciate that this is a technology that allows us to do that rich, holistic, whole child, whole person education, and that it's crucially about collaboration between not just people, which is fundamental, but also between artificial and human intelligence, so that we get both working together, not the fear of one replacing the other. So I think we've got to do some real preparation work. I mean, that project is great, Andrew, and it's a really nice example. And I think with us, we're sort of very practically down to earth, trying to help people get ready, help people to understand how this could really transform for the better and for everyone.
Yeah, and I think some of it's getting over the fear, isn't it? There's no doubt about
Yes,
it. And I think some of the advantage here is it's kind of got people over that motivation hump. You know, my mum, who's 90, you know, just could not persuade her to use anything. But now she's suddenly got a Facebook portal, as it happens, and she's answering phone calls. In fact, she's actually making phone calls on a video.
But that's brilliant. But also decision makers have suddenly woken up to that. We can do this. You know, for years, students at Oxford had been asking for lectures online. No, can't possibly be done. All these restrictions. Suddenly, all these barriers are down. Let's take advantage of that. Yeah, let's do it.
Well, I think it's been the leaders. In fact, I saw an interesting survey a few weeks ago talking about, you know, CEOs, CFOs, and HR directors being asked whether they were happy with their staff working from home. And in late March, when it all kicked off, there was only about 50% of them who were.
Yeah.
By mid-April, 90% of them were comfortable with it because, funnily enough, the staff are working harder, doing more, getting better performance, better QA, better customer sat. And so there was a bit of the leaders, I think, and education leaders fall into this, and all of us to some degree fall into saying, yeah, but it's all a bit hard, isn't it? We can't really do that. And suddenly, boom, you know, we've had to do it, and all that's gone.
Yeah.
Now we're getting on and doing it. But I think that in getting ready is important. And, you know, David, in your environment, I mean, as I said before, you know, you've done something to get ready, but you're in that world of higher education. And, you know, it's never been the most dynamic world in the world, environment in the world, is it? And now it's been really forced to do this. I mean, are you hopeful about that? Do you see a real opportunity? Is it going to really help everybody, or is it going to cause bigger divides? I mean, how do you feel about that at the moment?
Well, in terms of the question, how do we move towards this future? I think there's different ways of looking at that. I mean, one way you can set attractive visions. You know, you can create a vision of the future that's attractive to people and motivate people to move in that direction. There's certainly the heart and minds part, the organizational part, bringing the human characters along with you is another huge part. But there's also a practical element to this. And when we talk about education 4.0, what we're really talking about is the application of technology to the problem, you know, the application of computers. And in order to move towards that future, the first step has to be digitization, because until you've digitized the experience, there's no data for the computers to process. Right? So I see the most important, the biggest challenge is the digitization aspect. And I think what we've seen through COVID is suddenly education digitized en masse. And so this has certainly moved us forward in a big step. And the reason is I don't think everything's going to go back to the way it was before. You know, I think what Andrew described about lots of micro processes within our education institutions being digitized, and we're establishing new ways of doing things, new digital ways of doing things. And this new normal is going to continue for months and months and months and months. And so these processes, these digital processes, will become mature. I think the question is, how many people will then revert back to the old way of doing things? You know, certainly lots of things will go back to the way they were done before. You know, people will go back into classrooms, I'm sure. But lots of these digital processes will remain. And so I'm hopeful that what we've seen is a lot of progress towards that digitization. And once things become digital, then we can bring the power of computers, AI, machine learning, learning analytics, etc., to bear. So I'm hopeful that the current crisis has moved us towards this education 4.0 that we're discussing today.
Yeah, it'd be interesting because, you know, as I mentioned before, the fear thing is an important barrier here. You know, we often have heard teachers and others say, you know, well, I don't really understand this stuff. You know, there's a big challenge with people teaching technology inside schools, etc., or having an awareness, maybe even being able to catch up with the kids. Is that something you see as broadly spread around the world, Andrew? Is, you know, other people who are not finding that as much of a barrier because of other barriers? You know, is there something we can learn from that, I guess, about, you know, about how you kind of get over the fear barrier and start to use technology maybe better?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think it's a question of, are teachers involved in the design process of these technologies in the first place? I think the assumption that we can pilot and then give a technology, then get feedback and then pilot it. It's what is the reality of a teacher's day from morning to dusk and over the course of a week and over the course of a month. And I think we've seen the realities of that amplified when we're actually able to also see their personal lives interweave with the professional ones during the last 3 months. And, you know, I hope, building on on David's point and the whole, I think, conference also, you know, we're living in an era where we have a risk in education of snapping back.
Yeah.
And I think we actually, if this community is serious about its agenda and about its opportunity to use technology as an equalizer and also see schools as the equalizer in society, we actually have the opportunity to snap forward. And there are moments in history that we've seen this. And you mentioned some of the frugal innovations that have been coming from the proverbial global South with mobile money, with a number of different innovations. And I actually think that while there is some professional unfamiliarity with use of technology, particularly in areas where, frankly, it just costs too much to have even data to download one YouTube video, I think they are figuring what they could use the available technologies in order to supplement their pedagogical priorities. And I think that's the question that needs to drive us, particularly over the next 10 years. I mean, this is also in the context, and my colleague, Matt Reed, is on another panel around SDGs. And we still have a global set of goals to achieve in 10 years. And in fact, when we're thinking about what kind of data we're also going to learn from this, I mean, we're excited in this small consortium with Schools 2030 because we have a cohort of 5-year-olds that will be 15-year-olds, 10-year-olds that will be 20-year-olds, and 15-year-olds that will be 25-year-olds. We will not have just a project baseline and end line, and we also won't just have a product launch. We will have some information around how did we best support the journeys of learning as society, including Portugal, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, India, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Brazil. There's also a diverse set of contexts where we may not even know what the question is in terms that we're trying to answer, but we are committed to listening to the questions that teachers are asking. And I think that's what will help us enable our cadre of professionals to not fear change, but to be actually in the forefront of that change as education 4.0, 5.0, 6.0 continues to drive us forward.
Yeah, that's exciting as well. And I think the idea, and many of us know that when you're designing things, often designing them in a kind of slightly less plentiful environment is a good thing to do, you know. So designing with some of the challenges in mind is obviously a good thing to do, as opposed to designing, you know, because you've got everything available to you at any time. And I think as we think about this journey in the UK and Western Europe, maybe thinking a little bit more about how we would reflect on that if that was in an environment where, you know, where data was less accessible, where devices were less accessible, where, you know, even societal norms are not the same. So I think that's, you know, powerful. And we know that in the general inclusion challenge that we have at the moment, and we can see it in society, that we have to think about how we pull everybody into here. So we've probably got about 5 minutes left. So, you know, one of the things I'd like you to think about as we wrap up the session and go into the Q&A is really just, you know, I mean, sure, people are coming on here saying, oh, you're going to talk about robots and all that sort of stuff, you know. I mean, how do you really feel, you know, Education 4.0 could look? I know you've got Colin, I know you have Rose, which is I've heard about. It's a sort of you know, robotic innovation that you're experimenting with. It'd be really good to get a bit of a sense of that. But before, you know, maybe I'll ask you to just think about that bit before we wrap up. But, you know, I'd love to think that last year's panel, Rose and myself and the others were on the panel, ended up we wanted to go and hug teachers. That was our kind of call out from it. Go and hug a teacher, you know, because they're doing such a great job in a tough time. Absolutely. And I'd love to think that, you know, we had a sort of sense here now of really going and doing something. And one of what we meant by that wasn't just go and hug a teacher, although that's always a nice thing to do, but is actually, how can you get involved in this? You know, how can you change it? If you're a business person, don't just sit and go, oh, that's education's problem. They'll sort of that, or that's school's problem. Or if you're an educator thinking, well, yeah, I don't really, I'm going to educate these kids, and then business will work out what they want to do with them afterwards, etc. You know, how it's getting everybody involved in an inclusive way. And, you know, we've obviously cited a few times the 2030 thing. I mean, do we need to be doing something like that in the UK or maybe in Western Europe or whatever to try and get us? I mean, what can we really do to move things forward? You know, academically, you're working hard, but I suspect there's a lot of people who are not in academia going, that sounds interesting, but, you know, what does it mean to me? Well, what should we do?
Absolutely. It's got to be practical. But one thing that we can't do this, but it is one of the problems is we really need to take politics out of education.
Yeah.
Because it's hugely problematic in the UK. And I think it is something, it's a societal issue. It is all of us. You know, if you're an employer, you want employees who are well educated and you're responsible for professionally developing them. So it's not just a school's problem or just, you know, we do need to take responsibility as a society for building the context in which education flourishes. Yeah. So I think that is a huge problem. I do think we should be absolutely hugging teachers because if they had a challenging year last year, they've definitely had a challenging year.
Socially distanced hugging, of course.
Exactly, of course. And that's the thing, though. But that's the thing, isn't it? I think human contact is so important. I mean, I work in AI, and I know human contact is so important. You know, it is that being human that makes a huge amount of difference. So I think for everybody, it's about thinking about how we make sure we leverage our humanity in this crisis, how we leverage the fact that we can do so much that our AI can't. We can feel, we can have a subjective experience, and we need to empathize and sympathize and help people, you know, and really nourish. That's what I would say at the moment. Nourish people so that we can get back into a positive state.
Yeah, I think the humanization of technology is probably our biggest challenge, isn't it, over the next 10 years? How do we make it not feel like them and us, you know?
Exactly.
So David, if you're thinking about this, you know, thinking about the future, I mean, what's Imperial College or any of the other institutes, what's it going to look like in the Education 4.0 world? Is it going to be completely different, or do you think we'll recognize it?
Well, I'll take an optimistic view. There's a dystopian view we could focus on, but I'll take the optimistic view. And I think that, you know, we think of education in terms of systems. You know, we talk about education systems, and it is a system on the whole. You know, we have students starting at once a year. They go through from class to class in a cohort. We have assessment systems, and we do process. And the reason we do this is it's just not practical for each student to have their own teacher, for example, or their own teachers. You know, so in order to manage the economics of education, we create processes. But we also know that education is a deeply human experience, you know, and for students to fulfill their potential, mentors help, personalization helps, you know, for students to find their passion, to find their area of expertise. They need a great deal of personalization. So you have this conflict at the moment between, you know, practical systems and then personalization on the other hand. And I think the greatest use of technology would be to introduce a much larger degree of personalization to students. So they get much more personal attention, they can find their passion, they can find their areas of expertise. And technology can certainly help with that in a very significant way. So that's the utopia that we're hopefully heading towards. But my reflection on this conversation is the absolute key to that is to have teachers at the forefront of these conversations. And I think if teachers sort of sit back and wait for technology companies to solve the problem for them, then the results might not be the utopia that we're hoping for. Yeah,
we're probably going to run out of time, but Andrew, do you want to give a quick stab at how you'd like to see it after 2030, or maybe after, you know, Education 4.0 becomes real in the environment you have to deal with?
I think in short, 3 questions. One around data. Why do we care about what we can measure rather than measure what we care about? In education, I think we have a long way to go there. Number 2, how might we design educational solutions more with teachers and educators and students? And then 3, how might innovators actually approach schools as partners? And I want to offer the schools2030.org partnership. Here's 1,000 schools that we're going to be working with for the next 10 years. Please reach out to us if you say, I think we got an idea that we could help with. We could work with teachers for the next decade to get some things done.
Fabulous. Great call. And Rose, how are you is it going to be Colin who's dealing with all this in the future, or do you think we've got a place for yourself?
Well, absolutely. And I have to say, Colin is not a physical robot. It's about the infrastructure. It's about what I call the intelligence infrastructure that powers interactions between humans as well as with technology. I do not want to see the humans out of education. Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Okay, I think we've kind of run out of time on this panel, Georgia. I think if you're there, so I think we're going to walk over to our Q&A after this, aren't we?
Sure. Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.